My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old. And 14 months ago, I was sitting across the dinner table from my husband when my mother called to tell me he had just collapsed on her front porch. He was right there, pouring himself a glass of water, humming something under his breath, alive. I could touch him if I reached across the table. But my mother was crying so hard she could barely form words. Before I tell you what I found when I drove to her house that night, I want you to understand something. I am not a dramatic person. I don't exaggerate. I work as a pediatric nurse. I deal with facts, with vitals, with what is real and measurable. So when I tell you that everything I thought I knew about my life turned out to be built on something rotting underneath, I need you to believe me when I say I did not see it coming. Nobody would have. My husband, Ethan, was a high school history teacher, 34 years old. Broad shoulders, a calm voice, the kind of man who remembered every anniversary and never raised his voice. We had been married for 3 years. We lived in a 2-bedroom house in Columbus, Ohio, with a golden retriever named Biscuit and a kitchen that always smelled like the coffee he started brewing every morning at 6:15 without fail. Our life was ordinary in the best possible way. Not boring, just steady, predictable, safe. He traveled occasionally for work, accompanying student groups to historical sites, Washington, D.C., Gettysburg, Philadelphia. Those trips were never more than 4 days. When he came home, he always brought me something small, a postcard, a keychain, a book from whatever museum gift shop they had visited. It was such a small habit, but it made me feel known. That particular evening in October, he had been home for 6 days straight. No travel. No plans to leave. We had eaten pasta for dinner, the kind with the Italian sausage I make when the weather starts turning cold. Biscuit was asleep under the table. Ethan was telling me something about a student who had written a surprisingly good essay on the Civil War, and I was half listening, the way you do with someone you love and have lived with long enough to feel comfortable in the silence between sentences. Then my phone rang. It was my mother. The moment I answered, I knew something was wrong. She never cried on the phone. She was the kind of woman who handled everything with a tight jaw and a practical plan. But she was weeping in a way that made my chest close up instantly. "Claire," she said. "Honey, there's a man on my porch. He collapsed. The ambulance is pulling up right now. Claire, it's Ethan." I actually laughed. A short, startled sound. Not because it was funny, but because my brain simply rejected the information. "Mom," I said. "Ethan is standing in our kitchen. I'm looking at him right now." She couldn't stop crying long enough to respond clearly. I heard voices in the background, the crackling of a radio, urgent instructions. Ethan had walked over to me by then, his face creased with concern. He took the phone gently from my hand the way you do when you can tell someone needs help. He spoke to my mother quietly for about 30 seconds, then handed it back to me. His expression was careful and measured. "She's confused," he said. Or, "Someone told her it was me. You should go over there." I remember searching his face for something. Fear, guilt, anything out of place. I found nothing but calm concern. He squeezed my hand. "Go. I'll stay with Biscuit. Text me when you get there." I drove to my mother's house in 11 minutes. The ambulance was already leaving by the time I arrived. My mother was on the front porch with a neighbor who had her arm around her shoulders. When my mother saw me, she crumpled forward and I had to catch her. "They took him," she kept saying. "They took him to Riverside." The neighbor told me a man had rung my mother's doorbell just after 7. When she opened the door, he was slumped against the porch railing, barely conscious, his face bruised along the left cheekbone, dried blood at his hairline. He was wearing Ethan's brown corduroy jacket, the one I had bought him 2 Christmases ago. My mother said she knew it was Ethan because of the jacket, because of his hands, because of the way he said her name before he went unconscious. She said he had said Carol in exactly the way Ethan always said it, soft and familiar. I drove to Riverside Methodist. The man in the emergency bay was unconscious, hooked to monitors, an IV in his left arm. The nurse on duty asked if I was family. I said I thought so. She pulled back the curtain. The man on the gurney looked exactly like my husband. Not similar. Not like a cousin or a brother. Exactly. The same jaw, the same dark eyebrows, the same small scar at the corner of his left eye from a bike accident in college that Ethan had told me about on our second date. His hands rested at his sides with the fingers slightly curled, the way Ethan's always did. There was a wedding band on his left hand. I own the matching one. I had placed it there myself 3 years ago. I stood very still for a long time. The doctor explained he had severe dehydration, signs of prolonged sedation, and mild blunt force trauma to the head. Based on his condition, they estimated he had been in a confined space for somewhere between 1 and 2 weeks, kept largely immobile and sedated. He had not been able to speak since arriving. I drove home feeling like the road beneath me wasn't quite solid. The man at my house was standing at the kitchen counter when I walked in, eating leftover pasta cold from the container. Biscuit was pressed against his leg. He looked up with an easy smile. "How is she?" "Was it just a misunderstanding?" "They don't know who he is," I said carefully. He nodded slowly. "Probably homeless. Your mom panicked, thought it was me because of the jacket. These things happen." He came over and hugged me. He smelled like our laundry detergent, like the cedar soap he kept on the bathroom shelf. Everything about him was correct. I hugged him back and tried to breathe normally. That night, I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling. By morning, I had convinced myself I was overreacting. The man at the hospital was a stranger. My husband was here. The explanation was simple, and my exhausted brain was turning it into something it wasn't. But I started paying attention, not in an obvious way. I didn't ask strange questions or change my behavior. I simply watched, and I began collecting details the way I had been trained to collect symptoms. Small things that meant nothing alone but started forming a shape when placed beside each other. On the third day, he called Biscuit by the wrong name. Just once, quickly corrected. He said, "Hey, boy," and then reached down to scratch behind the ears, and for a fraction of a second, his hand hesitated, as if he wasn't sure where the dog liked to be touched. Ethan had always gone straight for the left ear. Always. Biscuit would lean into it every time. The man in my house went for the top of the head. Biscuit tolerated it but didn't lean. On the 5th day, I made lemon pepper chicken. Ethan's favorite. Had been since the first time I cooked it for him. He always asked for extra lemon, always ate it so fast he barely spoke during the meal. The man sitting across from me cut it into small, careful pieces and ate slowly. He said it was great. He ate every bite, but there was no particular happiness in it. The meal meant nothing to him. On the 7th day, I mentioned an inside joke. Something only Ethan would understand, a reference to the first movie we had ever watched together, a terrible science fiction film we had found on cable during a rainstorm. We had laughed about it for years. I brought it up casually, mid-conversation. "The way you do with a shared memory." He smiled. "Classic," he said. That was all. No specific detail. No correction if I got it wrong. Just a broad, agreeable response that worked for anything. My hands were completely steady when I set down my fork. Inside, I felt something cold and enormous settling into my understanding of what was happening. I went to the hospital the next morning during my lunch break. The man in the recovery ward was awake. He looked at me from the bed with an expression so raw and desperate that I had to grip the door frame to keep standing. He reached toward me, and his voice came out cracked and thin. "Claire," he said, "where have I been? How long has it been? Where is he? Is he in our house?" The room went completely silent except for the monitors. I sat down beside him. I took his hand, and then I asked him 3 questions that only my husband would know. The name of the street he grew up on. The first gift he ever gave me. The middle name of his youngest sister. He answered all 3 without hesitation. I cried in the hospital parking lot for 20 minutes, not the kind of crying that brings relief. The kind that opens a door you can't close again. I knew then, but I needed to know more before I could do anything with what I knew. Because the man in my house had been careful. He hadn't hurt me. He hadn't made a single obvious mistake until you looked closely enough. And if I confronted him without proof, without a plan, I had no idea what he might do. I did not tell anyone. Not yet. I drove home. I made dinner. I sat across from him. And I smiled and I talked about my day, and I watched him the way I would watch a patient whose diagnosis I had already made but hadn't yet confirmed with labs. Ethan, the real Ethan, was stable, recovering, in protective custody at the hospital once I quietly spoke with his attending physician and later a detective who listened with a carefully neutral face while I told him everything I had observed. He asked me to continue as normal for a little longer while they worked. He told me not to be alone with the man at my house if I could avoid it. He told me to be careful. I was very careful. I started building the picture from the edges inward. I pulled up our joint bank account statements on my phone while he was in the shower. Over the past 3 weeks, money had been moved in small amounts to an account I didn't recognize. Not enough to trigger an alert, enough to add up. I screenshotted everything. I forwarded it to my personal email from an old account he wouldn't know about. I looked at his phone one night while he slept. He had been meticulous. Almost no messages. A clean call history. But in the deleted folder, which he had forgotten to clear, there were texts to a number saved under a contractor's name. The texts were short and coded sounding, but one of them made my stomach drop. It said simply, "Move to phase 2. Timeline on track." I photographed it. I said nothing. I breathed. The detective later told me what had been pieced together from records, texts, and the testimony of 2 people connected to a private clinic in a suburb of Pittsburgh. The man living in my house was named Kevin. He was Ethan's half-brother, something Ethan had mentioned to me only once, years before we were married. They shared a father. They had met only a handful of times as children before Kevin's mother moved them to another state. There had never been a meaningful relationship. Kevin was 37. He had spent years tracking Ethan from a distance. What Kevin had accumulated in those years was something the detective described with a word I kept turning over afterward: obsessive. There were folders on a hard drive recovered later that contained years of research. Ethan's address history, his employment records, his financial portfolio, photographs of our house, our street, our routines, a detailed written timeline of our relationship, compiled from social media and other sources, going back further than our first date. Kevin had undergone multiple facial reconstruction surgeries at a private clinic over a period of 18 months. The surgeon later claimed he had been told Kevin needed reconstruction after an accident. The results were extraordinary and devastating. By the time the procedures were complete, Kevin's face was, at a quick glance, indistinguishable from my husband's. But a face is only the surface. What Kevin had apparently spent years doing was studying Ethan. His mannerisms, his speech patterns, the way he carried himself. He had been meticulous enough that the people who knew Ethan only casually never noticed. What he couldn't replicate were the small private things. The automatic tenderness toward a dog he had never met. The specific joy of a specific meal. The exact way a shared memory lives in someone's body, not just their memory. Ethan had been approached by Kevin 3 weeks before everything unraveled. Kevin had reached out under the pretense of wanting to reconnect, suggesting they meet for coffee at a location outside the city. Ethan, who was cautious but not unkind, had gone. He never came home from that meeting. Kevin had sedated him. He had held him in a rented cabin 2 hours outside Columbus, returning periodically to administer enough sedation to keep him disoriented and too weak to act. Kevin had taken Ethan's phone, his wallet, his jacket, his wedding band, and had walked into our house that same evening. When Ethan finally managed to escape the cabin, weakened and disoriented, he had only enough clarity to remember one safe place: my mother's address. He had walked to the road and flagged down a driver who brought him close enough, and then he had walked the rest of the way. He made it to her porch before he collapsed. Kevin's plan, as far as the detective could reconstruct it, was not impulsive. It had been years in the making. He had researched Ethan's assets carefully. Our house had significant equity. I had investments tied to an inheritance from my grandmother. Kevin had already begun the quiet, incremental process of shifting financial authority by the time I started noticing the wrong things. He had not counted on a pediatric nurse with a habit of cataloging symptoms. 3 weeks after I sat with Ethan in that hospital room, I was ready. I had asked Kevin, carefully and casually, whether we should finally get around to updating our estate documents, something I mentioned we had been putting off. He agreed immediately. Too immediately. He suggested a lawyer he had apparently already researched and called. He set the date himself. The morning of the appointment, I got up early and made his coffee, the way I did every morning. I sat across from him at breakfast, and I was so calm that I surprised myself. He made a small joke. I laughed at the right moment. He had no idea. The conference room at the attorney's office had a wall-mounted screen. When the attorney placed the documents on the table, Kevin reached for the pen with the ease of someone who believed they had won. He glanced at me with a small, satisfied expression that I will never forget because it was the last moment he believed any of this had worked. I put my hand on his arm. "Before we start," I said, "I'd like to show everyone something." I nodded to the detective who was seated at the far end of the table, someone Kevin had been told was a junior associate at the firm. The screen behind us came on. The first image was a photograph of the clinic in Pittsburgh. The second was a series of surgical records. The third was a side-by-side comparison, Kevin's face before and after, overlaid with Ethan's face. The fourth was the text message. "Move to phase 2. Timeline on track." Kevin stood up. His chair scraped back hard against the floor. The door opened. 3 officers came in quietly and arranged themselves in a way that left nowhere to go. Kevin turned once, a full rotation, as if some exit might appear if he looked hard enough. Then he stood very still. He didn't say anything. I think by then he understood that everything he had built, every careful layer of it, had already been methodically dismantled by the woman sitting across from him who had spent 3 weeks pretending not to see him clearly. He was arrested on charges that took the prosecutor 2 full minutes to list: kidnapping, aggravated assault, identity fraud, financial fraud, conspiracy, unlawful imprisonment. The charges related to what had been done to Ethan added years upon years. At sentencing, the judge made a comment that the planning and duration of the deception demonstrated a level of premeditation she had rarely encountered. Kevin received 32 years without the possibility of parole for the first 12. I was present. I sat in the front row. I did not look away. The weeks that followed were not simple. Recovery rarely is. Ethan spent 6 weeks in the hospital and rehabilitation facility before coming home. There were days when he was frustrated and exhausted and not himself, and I sat with him through all of it. There were nights when I woke up with my heart pounding and reached over to confirm the weight and warmth of the person beside me, and on some of those nights I would just lie there in the dark listening to him breathe until my pulse settled. Biscuit never left his side from the moment Ethan came home. The first thing Ethan did when he walked through the front door was get down on the floor and let that dog climb all over him, and I stood in the hallway watching them, and I thought about the night I had watched the man in my house reach for the top of Biscuit's head while Biscuit patiently waited for something that never came. There is something I want to say, because I have thought about it a great deal since all of this ended. People ask me how I didn't know sooner, how I shared a house with a stranger for weeks and didn't immediately understand what was happening. And I understand the question. I have asked it myself many times in the dark. The answer is complicated and uncomfortable. Part of it is that we trust the people closest to us with a depth that makes scrutiny feel like a betrayal. When someone wears the face of a person you love, your instinct is not to investigate. It is to explain away the wrongness. To assume you are tired, stressed, imagining things. To protect the version of your life you believe you are living. Part of it is that Kevin was genuinely skilled. He had spent years preparing. He had studied Ethan with a precision that was, in its own horrifying way, almost complete. The things he missed were things no amount of research could have given him. The automatic, unrehearsed responses of someone who actually loves you. The way a person's body knows another body after years of living alongside it. Those things cannot be faked. Not completely. And those are the things that saved us. I know what I was looking for now. I know the difference between a performance and a person. And I know that the man I married, the real one, is worth every terrifying week of keeping my face still while my world was on fire underneath it. Last spring, Ethan and I drove to the cabin. We needed to see it. I am not sure either of us could have fully closed that chapter without standing in the place where it had happened and letting it be real in the specific way that only physical places can make a thing real. It was smaller than I had imagined. A gray-sided building at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by trees. Someone had cleared it out long ago. It was just a room with a concrete floor and two small windows. We stood in the doorway for a while. Then Ethan took my hand and we walked back to the car. He started the engine. He looked at me once, and the look on his face was not the performed expression of someone demonstrating how they feel. It was just his face. Tired and grateful, and entirely real. We drove home. Biscuit was waiting at the door. That evening, I made lemon pepper chicken with extra lemon. And my husband ate it so fast he barely said a word, and I sat across from him in our kitchen and felt something I did not have a word for at the time. I have one now. Safe. I finally felt safe again. If you have felt like something in your life was wrong in a way you couldn't quite name, trust that feeling. You are not imagining it. The smallest details, the ones that feel almost too small to mention, are sometimes the ones that matter most. Pay attention to them. They're trying to tell you something. Thank you for listening to my story. If it reached you somehow, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single one.